Thank you, Jean Marie. I begin with a quote. This is from the author Annie Dillard, her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And for some context, for some time in her life, she worshiped in a congregational church. She writes, "On the whole, I do not find Christians sufficiently sensible of the conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews." What do you think about that? That quote came to mind after last week we were talking in the Palm Sunday story about the journey. We all through Lent, the theme, the journey, and about how there's tension in the journey. There's tension in the journey. And it increases as that last week of Jesus' life continues. So it begins, as we heard last week, Jesus is coming in with pilgrims into Jerusalem for the Passover, and there's folk who have certain expectations of what he's there to do, and he disappoints them, many of them, because some of them think that he's going to raise up an army and get rid of Rome, and he doesn't. Others think that he's going to protect the temple from Roman occupiers, that he's going to get rid of the enemy out there, and instead he goes into the temple and he starts cleaning it up. A symbol of cleaning from the inside out instead of getting rid of the outside or hurting the outside or attacking the outside. And as he moves through this week, there are some who embrace the message, some who want to be part of what God's doing, some who live into the healing, the creativity, the hope, the justice, the love that Jesus brings. But then there are others who say, no thanks, who really want to live in ways, even if they use God language, they're pretty committed to living in ways disconnected from God. And in the biblical narratives, there is this theology that we see weaving through that when people are living attuned with God, there is energy of creativity, there is justice, there is generosity, there's love. And then when people try to just do it on our own, apart from that creator and creativity, what tends to happen is we live in ways more so that are chaotic and sometimes harmful and destructive. So there's this idea in the biblical story, there is this raw material of creation, this chaos, and that God intersects with the chaos and creates. But that humans trying to live without God, the chaos comes back in. And one of the images in the Hebrew scripture and into the New Testament about that chaos is connected with the idea of water. Water out of bounds, water out of control. And if we think about ways that we can see water at work, we might understand why ancient people connected the idea of water with the chaos, with things coming undone, with things falling apart. Has anyone here ever seen footage of tsunamis crashing into a coastline? It just devastates everything. Anyone ever have pipes burst in your home? Right, yeah. Right. Sorry should have been a trauma warning about that. Here in the desert Southwest, we do love the rain. It's life-giving, but we're also aware of the power of the storms in the monsoon season, and a flash flood can come tearing through a mountain canyon and pour out into a wash and move what seem like immovable boulders. And if someone doesn't heed the signs and tries to cross that wash, we've seen the cars washed away, people even killed. The power of that water. We want to control it, but we can't. And so there's this idea in these stories of storm and tsunami and waves that symbolizes life when we're trying to do it just on our own. And so we see in that last week of Jesus' life, there's the beginning, the simmering of the storm, back on Palm Sunday, and when he turns over the tables in the temple, it starts to roil even more. And as we move through the week, we have religious leaders who are now intentionally plotting to kill him. And we have one of his disciples peeling away, Judas, and handing Jesus over to the religious authorities. And by the time we get toward the end of the week, the waves are cresting, the water is rising, and it is a tsunami of people in the square crying out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And then ultimately, Pilate, representing the power of Rome, who has the power to hold life and death, the ultimate manifestation of chaos. Well, Pilate washes his hands. What kind of washing is that? Right? It seems like he's pushing the water forward, pushing the storm forward. And so this tsunami of chaos crashes into Jesus. He dies on the cross, scatters his followers, abandoning him, denying him, fleeing and hiding. It seems like not just Jesus, but the whole movement smashed apart, scattered. It looks like the storm won. It looks like the waves won. It looks like chaos wins. And then to cap it all off, so to speak, they put Jesus in a tomb and roll a big old rock in front of it. And it's a way of saying this is the end of the story. Death wins, chaos wins, destruction wins. That looks like where it's going. And so we have a story, though, this morning that says, nope, chaos doesn't win. The destruction doesn't win. The death doesn't win. There's something about God that can take the smashed and the broken and bring it back together again. And not together in the way it was before, but in a new way, new life, new ways of moving forward. This is a story this morning that says that's God's truth. And so the invitation and the question for us is, well, what's that got to do with us? What do we do with that? Well, throughout Lent, we've been on this journey with Jesus. So this journey to the cross, well, now it's journey to resurrection. How do we participate in the journey? Well, we have some wonderful models in the story this morning. We have the women disciples. Some of you might have seen this on social media. It said, if you want a biblical Easter sunrise service, only invite the women. Who is there? It's the women. But let's back up from that. So we see this tsunami coming. We see the flash flood. We see the chaos roiling through that week with Jesus. And it looks like it's cresting. It looks like we're at the end. And when you're in the storm, when I'm in the storm, what do you want to usually do? We usually want to flee or try to control it, fight it, right? Fight or flight. That's the normal responses to the storms, the tsunamis, the chaos. And so the men disciples mostly flee. But we see the women, we see what they do is what Jesus taught everyone to do. Keep on following. Keep on following. And so even as everything feels like it's being ripped away and falling apart, the women walk that walk, and they are there at the cross. Can you imagine what it was like to watch that? To see hope die? Everything that you thought was possible being crushed? But they stayed, and they bore witness. I imagine there was conversation. I imagine there were tears. There were prayers. And then they watched, though, also as Jesus is put in the tomb, and the stone is rolled away over the tomb. Stone is rolled over the entrance to the tomb. They stick with him. They stick with it. And now, though, it's Sabbath. The sun is going down, and by their tradition and the rhythms of their life, they're supposed to observe this Sabbath. They're supposed to let go of work and doing. And it's hard for us to get our minds around it because we really lost any sense of Sabbath. I mean, whether it's on a particular day or any day, we're a go, 24/7, right? That's our culture. That's how we live. But still, we might wonder, for these women, everything's been smashed apart. Everything's fallen apart. Who cares about the Sabbath? Why bother? Why honor the Sabbath of a God who can't keep Jesus alive? Why? I mean, we could probably excuse them if they said, let's just skip it. There's women's basketball to watch. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of things to do, other things to do, except what we hear in the story is they honor Sabbath. And Jesus taught them to honor Sabbath in the truest sense of what it was, not just as a rule or a law, but the Sabbath is a gift for us. That when everything's falling apart, when things feel like they're smashing and crashing, what we need is not to fight and flee. We need to breathe. We need to pause. We need to stop. And so these women, disciples, they lit the candles. They made the meal. They likely remembered the story. They prayed the prayers. And I'm sure they were telling stories about all that had just happened. But they honor that time. They wait. And it's not because they didn't care. It's not because they didn't want to do something. They wanted to do something. And we have evidence of this because at the first possible moment, as light is dawning on Sunday, which was their first opportunity if they're honoring Sabbath to now go do something, they are on their way to the tomb. And I know intellectually we know this, but sometimes we forget it in all of the glory and joy and beauty of Easter. But they were not on their way to the tomb, humming, "Christ the Lord is risen today," right? They did not have their fancy garments on. There were no trumpets there waiting for them. There were not brunch reservations. They believe they're going to the tomb to mourn. And they do it. They are not going because they have hope that he is risen. They're going because Jesus taught them to weep. They had seen Jesus weep at the tomb of Lazarus. They saw Jesus weep on the way into Jerusalem. They heard the story of Jesus weeping in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus said and taught and revealed and embodied that when it's overwhelming and the waves are crashing in, cry that water out. Cry those tears. Let it go. Grieve. Touch. Anoint. They have prayers that are part of that grieving ritual, and so they're inviting God into that, and that's what they're there to do. So they followed Jesus in all these ways that he taught them. And then they hear a new possibility. They are surprised. They are absolutely surprised. We know this story. We're not surprised on Sunday morning to hear it. But you heard, they're like, who's going to roll the stone away for us? They don't expect an angel did it. Right? They expect it. Dead people stay dead. The dead ends stay dead ends. Those big heavy stones that block life in, they stay there. And what they're seeing, what's being revealed in this story, as they keep following Jesus step by step, Jesus, who kept inviting God in, Jesus kept experiencing new life, new possibilities, kept experiencing, even before Easter, he kept experiencing resurrection. They experience resurrection. They experience that what seemed dependable, death and taxes, there's something more dependable: creativity, possibility, hope, healing, justice, love, all the things that God says God wants to bring. As they follow Jesus, they see that those are possible. They begin to see that that's the reality that they're living in. And it is terrifying. We hear initially it said they fled, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Well, yeah. But eventually they did. Mark even knows that in his ending of the story. I think it's an ending that invites us to enter in. Well, what are you going to do? Right? Here's the news. He's risen. The stone is rolled away. All things are possible. What are you going to do? I think I'll run away. This is a reasonable response. But they didn't stay in the fear because they told the story. And Matthew and Luke and John, they weren't comfortable with that ending. They told the stories about what the women told. But even Mark wants us to understand they told the story eventually, because we wouldn't have a story if they didn't tell a story. So they eventually proclaim it, they eventually live it, they eventually share it. They live into resurrection too. And so we have this morning the reminder that resurrection isn't just something to celebrate, and it is something to celebrate, but it's something to live. It's something we're invited into as well. And yep, there's storms. I mean, literally, there's a rumble of thunder I heard this morning. Right? There's storms, there's tsunamis, there's flash floods, whether it's sometimes in our own bodies or in our relationships or in our communities or at the governmental levels, right? There's storms and chaos and messes, and we want to fight, and sometimes we want to flee. And we have a story this morning that says, but if you want possibility, if you want new life, if you want hope, if you want to find a way when there is no way, keep on following. Keep on listening, keep on honoring the silences, keep on sharing the stories, sing the songs, light the candles, weep if you need to, but keep following that way that clears the way, that rolls the stones away, that opens us up to the possibilities and the power of God's new life rising. One church that I served was a really large, high steeple downtown church. It had been historically the church in that city. The captains of industry, their names were on the chapel and the memorial, this and that, as well as on other buildings around the city. By the time I'm there, like most mainline churches, it had known its heyday, but still it was big. Almost 1,000 members, 400 people in Sunday worship. Mostly white middle-class people coming from suburban communities to this downtown church. The neighborhood was not white and suburban. And I mention that because one time we consistently did a Wednesday evening Bible study, and one evening, 2 women from the neighborhood came to the Bible study. Edna and Lisa. Edna and Lisa, mother-daughter, Lisa an adult daughter, Edna grandmotherly age. They were members of a black Pentecostal church, and they wanted a weekday Bible study. Their church didn't have one. They saw that we had one. And Edna said that first day there, well, we know what kind of church you are, but we figure if you got a Bible study, we might learn something. I imagine she learned some things over that course of time that she and Lisa participated. But I absolutely learned some things about trusting God from Edna, who I know as Mother Edna. That was a term of respect in her faith community. She was called Mother Edna, but it was also literally true. She had given birth to 11 children. 2 of those children had predeceased her. 2 of those children were incarcerated. Most of those children she had raised as a single working mother. She had known some really hard things. And when it was appropriate in the midst of our conversations, because when I'm leading Bible studies, people are sharing stories. It's not a lecture, right? We're sharing our experience, our strength, our hope. So she would at times share some of her stories. And I remember after, maybe it was a couple months, but she had shared one story earlier in the time together, and one of the members of that church who was part of that Bible study looked at her and said, given all that you've been through, how do you still trust God? How are you not done with God? And Edna, I can't remember if she said sweetie or darling, but it was a term of affection. She said, it's not easy. But she said, in my church growing up, here's what I learned. When you are in pain, you cry out. You cry out to God. You cry out to others. And she said, what I learned in the story is that God enters into the cry of God's people. The Israelites crying out. A woman throwing her child under a bush, crying out because she thought she'd been abandoned. God entering into the cries of God's people. And she said, so I learned to cry out with tears, sometimes with shouts and wailing, and sometimes it was in prayer, sometimes it was with other people. But every time I cried out, it wasn't quick and it wasn't easy, but I found a way forward. God always showed me a way forward. Every time I was slammed down, she said, I would cry out, I would ask for help, I would seek a new way, and sometimes it was slowly, but I would be raised up. And she said, so I've learned that over and over and over again. And she said, so now my prayer every day is, God, there are people crying out. Help me be part of your raising them up. And she said, I believe one day I'm going to die and go to heaven and live forever. She said, but I also believe the resurrection starts now. Amen.